Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Politics in the Pulpit, a lectionary-based preaching resource designed to ask the provocative question of how politics could appear in our preaching this week. I'm Adam, the advocacy coordinator for JPIT, unfortunately, today's guest is unwell, and hopefully they'll be coming back for another episode later in the year. So instead, we are graciously joined by the two JPIT interns, Thomas and Erica. Welcome, Thomas and Erica.
Hello.
Hello.
So we ask always in these podcasts the question, where have you seen politics in the pulpit? I know you've both kind of answered that before and probably quite recently answered that. But do you think there's a way in particular, as the JPIT interns and as the younger members of our team, that young people particularly want to see politics in the pulpit? And do you think there's a way that perhaps it resonates with them best?
I think young Christians that I've met and know expect quite a socially engaged faith. I think particularly if you, as the church in the UK, have had a decline in overall membership and engagement of young people, but with potentials of quiet, whispered revival, perhaps. Lots of those young people who are interested will be interested in how faith applies to the political and justice element of their lives. And that's because young people in the UK are the most progressive generation ever in the UK in terms of voting preference, in terms of their political sensibility, and one of the most progressive left-wing cohorts of young people of any country in the world, right? So it makes sense that this is something that is not maybe an add-on, but is actually quite lived out in many people's personalities or their day-to-day, something they look for in their career. Something I've had lots of young people know, I know, speak to me about I in the church is thinking about how to use your job well. I think as JPIT
Mm,
interns is something we're thinking about.
yeah.
But there's organisations such as Christians for Impact or Just Love, who we've done some work with, spend a lot of focused time on talking to students and young people about how can you use your time in the world of work effectively. And I think that's something that maybe the church doesn't really talk about. You wouldn't hear from the pulpit as much about how to kind of do socially engaged careers, that sort of thing. But I've found that when there has been a workshop on that or something about that at an event, it's often really popular. And the young people that have spoken to us at the denominational events that we've done this year, I think that's come up a few times. So I'd be interested in how that is addressed in a more in a preaching context about how you do socially engaged careers as a young person looking for a career.
Mm. Yeah, I really like that. I think building on what you mentioned, Thomas, in terms of linking to things about the quiet revival, I know that there have recently some of the statistics have been problematized for their actual research methodology, unfortunately. But I do think that I stand by the perspective that the findings in terms of encouraging people to think about why more young people, and I do think that I have seen people my age, as someone who's Gen Z, and people younger and slightly older, really reconnecting with discussions about spirituality and trying to find meaning in their lives. I think we're becoming very disconnected in society, and I've written recently some articles for a couple of faith-based magazines, and I spoke at an ecumenical event with youth leaders and talking about kind of why young people care about issues like Christian nationalism and really do resonate with issues of politics. And I think that one of the really important things that churches should be doing in order to not only engage with the issues in their community, but also to engage with young people is engaging with politics and social justice issues. And I think, like Thomas said, through jobs, that's been it's been a really great opportunity for us to be interns with JPIT. The applications have closed now, unfortunately, but we've we've been really enjoying exploring our own callings as Christians in the workplace. But yeah, I think as we try and reconnect with people and in this very confusing and messy and often frustrating world, I think people are returning to faith, and I think that our churches connecting with the political world and the political space is a really important part of young people finding refuge in churches rather than just being further disillusioned by another institution that's let them down. Um, so yeah, I think that's what I'd say.
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear. As someone that recently had a birthday and has transitioned to no longer being able to say that I'm in my mid-20s, it's nice to hear what the youth think. So this episode is based on the lectionary passages for Sunday, the 3rd of May. And then let's set the context with some of the news headlines that are in the news while we're recording this. They might be different by the time you hear this episode. The average price of a new electric car in the UK is now lower than petrol vehicles. I think that's the first time that's happened, and obviously good for the climate. Donald Trump has extended the Iran ceasefire indefinitely, but the blockade continues, and we've seen continued attacks on ships, I think, from kind of both sides there. A 17-year-old boy pleaded guilty to the synagogue arson attack in North London. And UK inflation rate has risen to 3.3% in March, quarterly driven mostly by the kind of war and conflict that we've seen. And the awareness days, this is still the month for awareness of mental health. The lectionary readings that we're going through today are for the Sunday, 3rd of May, and they are Acts 7:55 to 60, Psalm 31, 1 to 5, and then 15 to 16, 1 Peter 2 to 10, John 14, 1 to 14. And then we've mentioned this in our previous episodes, but just worth saying again that as part of a trial of recommended adjustments to the revised Common Lectionary, the consultation on common text has suggested a number of changes to help churches address the historic problem of anti-Judaism in Christian interpretation. For this week, suggested alternatives are available, and you can see where those suggested alternatives are and what they are. Then you can see the accompanying article linked in the show notes. So with all of that in mind, and with those news stories and those awareness dates, let's have a look at the texts. So Thomas, Erica, is there anything in these passages that you particularly resonate with you, or you felt particularly would call you to kind of preach on? Or is there a kind of a broader theme across them that you talk about?
I would say some of the key themes that stood out to me from these readings, I think there's definitely kind of a strand that you can pick out in terms of um, doubt and struggling to trust in our faith. I think, with everything that's going on in the world, it is always slightly grounding to come back to lectionary passages, which do offer some sense of guidance, and particularly the famous John 14 passage, "I'm the way, the truth, and the life," has supported and encouraged and reassured so many people throughout history. I think so. I think those ideas about doubt, and particularly as activists wrestling with how things are, and also in light of it being Mental Health Awareness Month, people wrestling with their own personal battles, whether that's through work or in an education context as young people. I mean, young people have particularly high rate of mental health struggles. Finding these opportunities in reading our Bibles to ground ourselves despite everything that's going on, but also whilst recognizing that those things are going on. So it's not just kind of toxic positivity, but I think these passages are kind of trying to ground us in reality, but also hope, if that makes sense.
That's great. Yeah. I like the idea of being grounded. I think I took as a theme a bit of an interesting binary between the kind of heaviness of God and the lightness of God. And there's lots about uh, of rock, hard, heavy, reliable, the house of God being kind of, you can imagine maybe imposing or like a bastion or these kind of quite strong, heavy words, clunky words, which is really nice. But there's also about the face of God upon you, is mentioned that kind of, and that really made me think of lightness and kind of how light God holds us lightly and we hold our faith lightly, as well as kind of really needing to grip on the rock. So both of those descriptions are really helpful to think about the nature of God. Um, for me anyway. And I think that then leads into maybe my favorite kind of theme across this particular set of readings of home or belonging in place, kind of with God or under God, and how we find belonging and community and togetherness, with God alongside us. I think that's definitely cuts across the passages.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that part, the thing you said around Erica around like toxic kind of positivity, that's like a kind of a risk and something that we also need to talk about the kind of realities of life, and particularly for people going through mental health struggles, because as we said, it's still that awareness month. Sometimes that can be really difficult to go to places and see this kind of certainty and this like kind of rejoicing in things when you're in that kind of that space. And so um yeah, just holding where people in your congregations and the people you're preaching to might be while you're talking about some of these things. It's really important. So let's start looking at the passages a little closer. Should we start with the Acts passage, which is I read it and was like, oh, it's pretty pretty gruesome. So
Yeah, a strong biblical start to this set of passages with a stoning. I was thinking about the themes of kind of political challenges and figures who oppose institutions and oppose established authority. I think Stephen particularly embodies that. He's been speaking out against the Council of Jerusalem, and he's then persecuted and killed for seeing things in a different way. And I was reflecting on kind of the idea that actually his vision was a positive one. And coming back to what I mentioned about toxic positivity, his vision wasn't just that we'd, overthrow the existing authority and then because everything is bad, it's about focusing on the hope and the glory of God, and the positive things that are yet to come, which and his own experiences with God, like I say, rather than what the negative things that are occurring. And I was also reflecting how within society we have a tendency to kind of persecute, I suppose, people who do bring that more positive approach and are more optimistic. And it's like, well, clearly that person is crazy because they think that, like things are all going to be fine when the world is absolutely awful. But actually, as Christians, we do have somewhat of a calling to really elevate that kind of perspective more, and covering our ears to the good news, as it says in the passage. I think is a dangerous thing, and I think part of the great thing about being an activist and a Christian is that I feel that it really reignites that hope and the possibility that things can get better. What about you, Thomas?
Mm. Yeah, I think there's a couple of bits. I've been cheeky, but in a way, I think it's fair enough, and looked around the passage, which is especially
Oh,
good if you start in the middle, in medias res. It's good to
yes.
have a little cut around. So the end of Act 6, there's a little description of Stephen as having the face of an angel, which I think is really nice. That was part of why I got that theme of kind of the face and likeness of God.
Mhm.
But it's really interesting that that interacts with what you said about kind of the symbol of hope or of
Mm.
utopia, of something better, something different. That's quite angelic, I would say, that it's that it kind of marks people out as separate, as different. We think about Christian art and the use of a halo or of a physical kind of likeness of face for the Christ child especially, and Mary and the disciples. Other key figures in the scene are often marked out with a likeness, which I think is really nice. There's just for this bit as well in verse 48. It says the Most High does not live in houses made by human hands. I think it's really nice that God overcomes boundaries in in their or his or her omnipotence, kind of penetrating through into all the bits of our lives, of our structures, of the way that our societies work. I find that really inspiring. That the idea that the boxes we make, it's that imagery of bursting through. Actually, that God really comes out all around. Um, I like verse 52 also just before that, thinking about the persecution of the prophets. And it made me think about what you said, Erica. Which modern prophets of justice do we ignore or do we gnash our teeth at? Which is a very interesting phrase. Um, and the flip side of that really is that the proximity of Stephen to God in this passage is what results in his being killed. I think that the idea of having to cover your ears and yell is a fear response, right? That the crowd are scared of the possibilities that Stephen is highlighting, scared of the rupture of power, of the changes and the vision of something different, and the response is to kill. And that makes me think about the oppressors we see in our world, where
Mm.
we know that God might tug on their hearts. When climate criminals and war barons and dictators operate hate and violence and torture and death, we know that God is there tugging on their hearts and they're ignoring it. They're covering their ears. They must know that this is wrong, that this is against a vision that God has for the world and a vision of human flourishing, and they do it anyway. Um, I think that is quite nice to think that that's always been there. We can see these angelic uh, characters in the New Testament, especially, that really show us another path. And then finally, right at the end, verse 60, when the kind of humility and grace it takes for Stephen to say, "Do not hold this sin against them." That is obviously a challenge for us. Once we've identified, I've just identified a list of enemies. That might be, controversial. I said climate criminals. I said war barons. I said dictators. I think lots of people would say yes, these are the enemies of the justice that the church wants to pursue. But then, what do we do about that? How do we love them? How do we forgive? How do we work in the world to uh, negotiate how we actually live that out? I think it's a very powerful passage to kind of start a lectionary with, actually, and it made me think about all those things mixed together.
Yeah, and particularly that last point made me think. I mean, it's been so prevalent in our work around responding to Christian nationalism and how we can love our enemies when our enemies might claim to be a different kind of Christian.
Yeah, I'm going to say something that I think I've probably said on this podcast, but all the times I've been on it before, but about how this the kind of Christian tradition and things gives us, and the gospel gives us as Christians an easier way of seeing a more hopeful future than it
Mm,
does for some other people. And perhaps that is why, like we spoke about earlier, young people are starting to explore that more because they're seeing what I would describe as a pretty hopeless time in kind of politics,
mm.
nationally and certainly internationally. Um, that there's an attraction to this kind of this ability to see a better future for themselves. Okay, with that, should we move on to our next passage, which is Psalm 31? And Thomas, I'm going to ask you to go first this time.
Sure, yeah, yeah. This is a lovely psalm. I think it raises those themes I mentioned at the start. Of thinking about um, God as a rock of refuge, but also I think that other part of it in verse 5 of really lovely refrain, "Into your hand I commit my spirit." I think that's quite a gentle description. I think that idea of God God kind of holding us, of being. I can really imagine, the parents' open arms and being quite us as little babies in the hands of God. That's where our spirit lies. That's really nice. Like this psalm has both. It's got the strong fortress and it's got the gentle hands holding our spirits, and that's lovely. But it also makes me think about that verse 5. What do we need to do to kind of willingly submit to allow our spirit, maybe our inner self or inner child, to be embraced by the love that is God, that goes beyond our understanding? I think that can be that requires quite a lot of vulnerability, humility from yourself, but also, as you were saying, Adam, that's what gives us the power to kind of imagine something different and the power to be delivered from our enemies. If you look at verse 15, that maybe is challenging language sometimes, the way that, especially in the Psalms, you can tell the psalmist is pretty fed up of his enemies. But the way that we respond to that, I think, is to draw on that power that we find from the loving spirit that God has given to us, and that we should expect traps, snares, things waiting to trip us up, but actually we know that that is where our power comes from, and I think that's really helpful for when we're thinking about the justice work that we do too. Um, uh, the other thing I really liked was the idea that God inclines his ear to us. It makes me think about how we listen to one another. Do we listen deeply and intensely as God does? If it's an amazing thing for God to incline his ear to us, to really understand the testimony of each other, to the pain of each other, and then to listen to the voice of the voiceless, of those with lived experience, of those suffering marginalization and oppression. How do we listen? And that, as a real precursor to action, is something I think we really value, and it's something that JPIT really wants to cement in our practice and the way that we think about the issues that we work on as well, is to really care about that listening.
Yeah. I really liked everything that you said. Definitely all of those themes kind of appeared to me as well. And yeah, building on the ideas about loving your enemies and how we negotiate that. I was reflecting particularly on the idea of shame, and this prayer from the psalmist, do not let me ever be put to shame, and how it kind of contrasts with what happened to Stephen in the previous passage, because, he is really open about his faith, and speaks out against those in power, and then he is humiliated and killed. And how this idea that maybe shame is sort of an inevitable part of the experience of being human, and particularly, this is in the season of post-Easter, where we've been talking a lot about the crucifixion and Jesus' ultimate humiliation on the cross. And then in terms of how that relates to us as people of faith and people involved in activism, the idea of feeling shame at not doing enough, at not contributing enough, not having enough time. I feel like maybe this is quite particular to some of the people that I hang out with or speak to, but the sort of constant feeling that you're not quite helping out enough, even though, I mean, we're doing this as JPIT interns, we work on this as our day job. And then I know that Thomas and I and other people in the team have spoken about how, well, we don't do enough, outside of work though, like other activism and other things. And I think negotiating that with the idea of faith being our refuge, and that God doesn't mind about all those things, but also that shame is still, it's a valid human experience and a valid human emotion, and that people do feel that, in all sorts of ways. So maybe that would be something to draw on in preaching. And also this idea of refuge as potentially a way that
Mm.
sometimes we hide from the world, and kind of do the opposite of bringing, our faith into the public square, but actually we retreat from the public square and we go, well, my faith is my refuge, and therefore I'm going to protect myself, and I'm just going to be in my church community, and that's all fine, and I'll just cover my ears from everything else that's going on. But actually, what we're really called to do is, whilst that faith is our refuge, we shouldn't always be there. I don't know if that's the best way to phrase it, but we shouldn't stay in that place.
It's a really interesting point. I think the contrast between um, Stephen in the last passage and how what happens to him at the hands of his enemies, and then this about being a prayer and praise for deliverance from enemies is really kind of instructive of how we should be, that we can pray for enemies and pray for that their
Mm.
hearts would be changed, but that still, no matter what they do, we're taught to love them. And I do also hear that thing of shame and not feeling like you're doing enough and all of those sorts of things. I have to put a quota on myself now that I don't read too many books about climate change, and I have to put novels in every now and again because it's part of my work, and I find that it becomes too sad if I read too much about these things.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's about finding that balance and finding what allows you to keep going. I can't remember who we were talking to. It might have been a conversation we were having in the team about how kind of ministers and people of working in churches kind of keep going. And
Mm.
somebody said, just find a hobby that is kind of outside of these things, and don't be
Mm.
ashamed of that you're not using it to spread the gospel, but that's refueling you, and that's rest, and that's productive, and all those kinds of things.
Mm.
Mm.
With that, should we move on to the verse from First Peter?
I was reflecting on this passage, and I think, one thing to maybe caution against is that sometimes the language of being a chosen race and a chosen nation has been weaponized against certain groups, and the danger of falling into that sort of narrative, or at least acknowledging that potentially in preaching, and that this isn't a way to go, we're the good ones and everyone else is bad. But yes, in terms of other things to talk about, then I was thinking about living stones and how that could relate to maybe living earth and ideas about creation care. And particularly when I was younger, I did quite a lot of reading around kind of creation care and stewardship and the different language that we use in terms of our theology around climate justice. And I remember reading that some people were quite critical of the idea of stewardship. I think some people use stewardship as the main argument for why we should be involved in climate justice work, but actually kind of the steward thing of like taking care of something inanimate and that's not alive is very different to this idea of kind of a living earth and creation care and being kind of in harmony with your environment. And that's up for debate, but I really liked this image of living stones, and yeah, coming back to some of the stuff that Thomas was saying about how that relates to the nature of God as well. And then yeah, I think it touches on wider questions around how we build our spiritual lives, without shame, as I was talking about, and but also trying to follow Jesus as best we can in the choices that we make, in the systems that we support, the companies that we support or boycott, and things like that. But that, the reality is that we will stumble and we will fall, and that's okay.
Yeah, nice. I like the way you thought about the living stones in a creation way of creation care. That's really interesting. I hadn't made that connection. That's really helpful. I also really liked that verse 5. But focusing on the idea of a spiritual house, which I thought was really interesting.
Mm.
Makes us think about how we use our buildings, how we use our community structures. What does it mean to be a spiritual house? I thought of the words kind of cohesion. What does it mean to be collective and kind of holistic in
Mm.
the way that we as people of faith, but on multiple layers, kind of in our own our own hearts and our own actions. How do we build community, a spiritual house wherever we go? How do our church communities do it? And then how do our church structures at kind of a national level do it? And that probably includes providing shelter, right? And warmth is what a house is for. It's shelter, warmth, and it made me think of the idea of being salt and light, of being the lamp in a house on a hill, shining out. That's a really beautiful way. And then the idea of Christ as cornerstone as well, in verse 6, that we are our homes, our communities are constituted by Christ as the base load for it. And then that made me think of a lovely turn of phrase that Christ can be our load bearing wall, right? That we have Jesus there to take our weight, but also like we can't have the house and the community and the kind of love and solidarity that community results in without him, because he is the root, the load-bearing wall, right? So I really like that idea of I think the connection between kind of the communities we create, and whether that's from kind of communities within our own families as well, or new monastic communities, new Christian communities, is something I'm interested in, or the church as a whole, as a body, as an institution, maybe. What does it have the responsibility to do? And I think it's about providing shelter, warmth, welcome to all, to be inclusive, right? I liked verse 10 right at the end, that idea of movement. Once you were not a people, now you are. You hadn't received mercy, now you have. There has been movement and change over time. That's the narrative of the Bible, whether it's an Exodus narrative in the Old Testament, or whether it's kind of the building of the early church in the New Testament. And there's lots of other examples of kind of groups of people moving into something better, moving into a better place. And it really makes me think about the scope of God's love, which is permanent, but that we kind of move into it. We embody it more and more over time. And I think that links back to what we were saying earlier about a kind of having a hopeful disposition, having an idea of what the world could look like, that is kind of we move into. It makes me think of the fruits of the Spirit as well, that these are kind of principles, but they're not like targets. They're things we already have. We already have these the fruits of the Spirit, or the principles of love, or the principles of kind of belonging. These are things that are behind us that we rest on, as our load-bearing wall, perhaps, and we look into the future. It makes me think of what you said, Erica, about almost feeling guilt, feeling like you aren't doing enough, that there's always kind of a striving to a better standard of person of faith, a better, standard bearer for justice, work, or mission, or just being someone that you want to be, being the best version of you, which I don't think is always very helpful. You don't always want to be looking to this kind of big vision in the sky of like what an ideal person is that's completely
Mm.
uprooted from any realistic context. What we know actually is that we can rely on lots of this stuff already. This has already been there. The foundations are there for us to build as people of faith, as the church. I found it a very comforting passage, actually.
Nice. And then finally, John 14.
Yeah, I mean, this is such a well-known part of the Bible. I feel like it's been preached on in so many ways, and it's difficult to, I suppose, always find new things to say about it. Um, and I don't want to sound like a broken record either, but I think, it's again that message of even if you stumble, there is a direction and there is a path and that we can follow through our faith in Jesus and through the support of our church community and our church family and through our trust in God, that things will be okay, and that doubt is that key sort of barrier. I think, yeah, Jesus, the idea of the journey and the walk, we were talking a few weeks ago with John T. Langley about the the walk on the road to Emmaus passage and kind of the spirituality of walking, and I found that quite interesting. And kind of the physical act of like walking together alongside your faith community. But I think also that the idea of the way and the journey and does point towards kind of these fruits of the spirit, like Thomas mentioned, and particularly the fruits of the spirit, being related to our activism and finding that joy and that peace in the work that we do, not only within our church communities or social action projects and things, but the upstream work, the social justice outreach and building community relationships and national advocacy or other things that we're doing. I also think it can be used again to exclude non-Christians. I found a very brief commentary which was talking about how C.S. Lewis in the Narnia series, in the seventh book, there's the character, I think, Emeth, who is a really faithful follower of. I've not read the seventh book in the Narnia series for a very long time, for context. So this was a refresher from this person's writing. But apparently he follows a different religion, so he doesn't follow Aslan, but he's very faithful in that. But then is accepted by Aslan because of this kind of idea of, in my father's house, there are many dwelling places, and the idea of kind of interfaith work and being the different dwelling places. And I quite liked that as a way of thinking about how different people approach the way and the truth, particularly in this kind of post-truth era, I suppose. But yeah.
That's great. Yeah. The phrase "the way" is very helpful. It's kind of thinking about discipleship and what does it mean to kind of follow Christ as person is really important. I agree with that. But I think a couple of things I'd pull out would be in verse 2. In my father's house there are many dwelling places. Again, that idea of dwelling. I think that word "dwelling" is really interesting as well. Like it kind of it does connote physical place, a dwelling, but also I think I think of it as quite a quaint thing almost, that like a dwelling is kind of quite a little house or quite something quite personal to you. It does sort of it's not quite home. There is a different term going on there, but I think it's quite comforting that you can dwell in a way that you might move, but you can be comfortable without moving. So I mean, it's sort of you might be itinerant, which we're called to be. The way, the truth, and the life very much connotes movement to me, that you are moving towards a vision, as we've been talking about, the idea of movement, but also you can rest and you can dwell and you can dawdle. That might be all right as well. I also quite like the way at the end of the passage, Jesus is talking about how it's possible to do greater works than the ones he did. Right, verse 12, you will do greater works than these, because he's going off to the Father. That's an amazing thing. That we can follow in the footsteps and kind of really come into our own in the way that we do that following, and we kind of take on leadership roles as well within our church communities. The way that we become confident in our own proclamation of these principles of faith and justice. We can be prophetic, right? We have spiritual gifts that we can use, and that's quite an open dialogue with God as well. I think that's something that's really affirming of our own ability. Again, linking to perhaps doubts or feeling guilt that we're not good enough. These are themes that, especially in Mental Health Awareness Month, I think everyone thinks. I think there's an increase across all age groups in society and across all different groups of people that people are feeling anxious, lonely, unsure, like they aren't skilled up for, the changes in the job market we're seeing. Like they aren't prepared for social and economic changes that are coming, right? People don't feel prepared, but actually we can be. We have the power through Jesus to be prophetic, to use our spiritual gifts, to have real dialogue with God about what do we do now? What is ours to do in this place? What do we discern that we do next? Because Jesus tells us this in the end of this passage. If in my name you ask me for anything, I will do it. That is Jesus very much as friend, as ally, as helper, as well as God. And that they are one and the same. So I think it's there's a lot to get out of it, even though it can be very familiar, especially a familiar passage of the Bible. It's always good to, pick apart a different bit.
Great. Thank you so much for those thoughts, guys. I found that really rich and encouraging and nice to kind of delve into those passages with you. Thank you for stepping into the void, Thomas and Erica, and preparing at short notice. And thank you everybody for listening. I hope this episode helps you in your preaching preparation. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review wherever you listen to your podcasts and share this episode with your friends. We also have online spaces for further engagement and discussion about faith and politics on our social media platforms. I'm going to leave you with a little story and then a prayer. I recently went on holiday to Montenegro, and it's very nice. One of the things I did there was I went to a place called Ostrog Monastery, which is an Orthodox Christian monastery that is on a basically kind of vertical cliffside where they built. Originally, it was just these caves, and they built this kind of facade. And I found, and something I find very interesting in the UK is going to different churches and seeing different Christian traditions, but there's not a lot of, certainly where I live, opportunities to see Orthodox Christian traditions. And so I really relish this opportunity to go and see how they do things and look at things and say, oh, that's different perhaps to how I would do things and how and these kinds of things. And yeah, so I just found this snippet of this prayer that is from or to Saint Basil, who is the person that founded this monastery, and there might be terms or phrases or things that sound a bit kind of odd to our ear, but I think the kind of core to it is actually really comforting at how kind of aligned we are across these kinds of Christian traditions, where we might see how we worship and how we do things very differently, and people might try and put wedges between people, but actually at the core of this is a call to justice. So the prayer goes. With prayer and tears, you have warmed the cold cliffs of Orstruck. Please warm our hearts with God's Spirit so we can be saved. From all corners of the world to your grave come the weak and the ill, and you helped them, got rid of their demons as well as the devil, and healed their souls and bodies. Please continue to help everybody as me as well. You brought peace to fighting brothers. Please continue to bring peace. Help the divided, make the sad happy, calm the stubborn, heal the sick. Amen. Thanks for listening.